Hi, my name is Sipiwe Baleka, and among other things, I am a historian, a genealogist, and a scholar. And this is part two of my Black History Month presentation, which is entitled Half the Story Has Never Been Told: Ethiopia, Malcolm X, and the Liberation Story They Didn't Tell You. Now, this is part two of the story. In part one, I covered the period of the beginning of the Earth's original people, their migration out of Africa, the differentiation of the races, and how a genetically mutated group of people uh, migrated back into Africa and attacked the Earth's original people, starting this original conflict. We covered the rise of the Shashu nomads, who were these people that came into Africa and took over and started this war against um, the Earth's original people, who came out of this area that we call Ethiopia, and how the Shashu created a religion where they considered themselves the chosen people of God, and how the Romans came and conquered both the Shashu and some of these Earth's original people. And they kept coming from the north and the east and going into Africa, Egypt, and constantly trying to make their way south, and how there's only a group of the Earth's original people called Ethiopians, or we shall call them Ethiopians, who maintained their freedom and independence after all these thousands of years of invasion. And they had migrated, to escape the invaders. They would migrate down the Nile Valley and then across the Sahel corridor over to West Africa and established all these independent kingdoms. So we covered this history basically from the beginning of mankind up until the slave trade, and how these people were brought to the Americas, and how their dream up until the time of the Civil War, everything they thought about, they prayed, their dream was to return home. It was never to stay in America, it was to leave. And that after the revolt of Nat Turner in 1831, a decision was made to teach them the Christian religion, to make them subservient and obedient. And this was also done on the African continent. And then we get to 1884, right, where this invasion is nearly complete. And by the end of 1884, the entire African continent is controlled by the invaders. And there's only one group of free and unconquered independent people left on the African continent and on the planet. And this is where we pick up the story, because as you can see here, the Italians, they control this part of Africa and this part of Africa. And they don't have much territory. And they want to try to link their two colonial possessions. And the resources, so much of the resources are here in this free territory. So what we're going to see is the Italians, under the global worldwide religious supremacy of the Pope, are going to make this last attempt to try to, once and for all, defeat the last group of free and independent Earth's original people. So this is where we pick up the story. Not too long after the Berlin Conference, there was the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition at the World Fair that was held in Chicago. And African Americans stood as a people without a nation until Florville Hippolyte let African-American leaders use the Haitian pavilion as a platform of protest. You had all these different people from around the world, but African-Americans weren't even allowed and they weren't represented as a people. And so at this event, they convened what was called the Congress on Africa. Okay, it was attended by people like Alexander Crummell, T. Thomas Fortune, Bishop Henry Turner, Bishop Alexander Walters of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, who 7 years later would chair the London Congress. And so at this 1893 gathering in Chicago, these militant, Negro leaders who knew themselves as Africans and Ethiopians, and they were members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, they organized this first conference where they had this Pan-African vision that had been given to them, as we saw in the first part, by Martin Delany. Even before that, in 1829, by the writer Alexander, who wrote the Ethiopian Manifesto. So from 1829, they already had this Ethiopianism, this Pan-African vision that was developed by others like Delany and Blyden. And so they had this conference in 1893, which would be the beginning of the Pan-African movement. Most of the time, history is taught to us that the Pan-African movement started with the London Congress, but the London Congress was actually planned at the Chicago Congress. And there was continuity because, again, Bishop Alexander Walters would be the chair of the Pan-African Congress. So in 1893, you start to have this Pan-African movement organizing. 2 years later, in 1895, another Pan-African repatriation plan was initiated by Black businessman William H. Ellis, who backed the efforts of the Georgia preacher Henry McNeil Turner. And at the end of the year, the Congress on Africa convened in Atlanta. So first they convened in Chicago in 1893. 2 years later, they convened in Atlanta. Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden submitted a paper entitled Africa and the Future of the Negro Race, and Bishop Turner gave an address on the American and his fatherland. 2 years after that, Benito Sylvan, a Haitian-born and former secretary of the Haitian legation in London, he visits Ethiopia and becomes an aide-de-camp in the imperial household of Emperor Menelik. And it's against this backdrop that the African Association was launched in England that year. 3 years later, Benito Sylvan attends this London Pan-African Conference, and he serves as the Ethiopian representative. 3 years later, Benito Sylvan returns to Ethiopia, where he introduces William Ellis, right, to Emperor Menelik II, and together they tell the emperor, Europe for the Europeans, and they repeat Martin Delany's cry for Africa for the Africans. Right? So this is how it gets started in Ethiopia. They start to become conscious of the Black people and the Americans through all this activity. This Ethiopianism, it started all the way back in 1790s, George Liao in America, has now spread, right, to South Africa, 1804, right? Ethiopianism at Cape Town. The modern native creed of Ethiopianism is an offshoot of the American Episcopal Methodist body, of which a community of a large number of wealthy Negroes are members. From them, the whole scheme of Ethiopian emanates. And immediately they start working for their liberation and they're persecuted. Okay? Now, by 1908, a man named Daniel Robert Alexander, who was born in Missouri and lived in Chicago, ends up going to Ethiopia, which is called Abyssinia at this time. He marries a local woman. Okay? He's from Chicago, and at the time, right, the biggest, most well-known Black newspaper in the world is the Chicago Defender. And so Daniel Robert Alexander is carrying some of these Chicago Defender newspapers. And when he goes to Ethiopia in 1908, he has an audience with Ethiopian Emperor Menelik, and he's teaching them about the African Americans, and he's showing them the newspaper. And this is how the Ethiopians really get to know what is going on with Black people in America. By 1917, Ras Tafari, whose father was Emperor Menelik's commander of the army, officially becomes the regent of the Ethiopian Empire and heir to the throne. And again, all during this time that Daniel Robert Alexander is at the court, Menelik's court, this young man named Ras Tafari is at the Ethiopian court hearing about African Americans. And so he becomes a regent and Ethiopian of the Ethiopian Empire and heir to the throne in 1917. During that year, a Black man named Charles Henry Holmes, who goes by the pen name Clayton Adams, writes this book called Ethiopia, the Land of Promise, a book with a purpose. The book was a novel best described as visionary prophetic fiction. In the book, 5 Black men had strange dreams, which caused them all to meet together on May 5th. One of the dreams pictured Black soldiers and a red, gold, and green flag. The men began meeting on the 5th of every month and then realized that their dream was about forming an organization, the Ethiopian Union, in order to combat and conquer Jim Crowism in America. That same year, another man named Robert Athley Rogers produces the Negro Map of Life. He begins traveling across the United States preaching the law of Ethiopia's redemption. And that same year, Marcus Garvey organized the first branch of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he repeats what Martin Delany said in 1859 and what William Ellis said to Emperor Menelik in 1903, 1904, the call for Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad. A lot of people think Marcus Garvey was the first to say that. He was only repeating what he had learned from William Ellis, which originated with Martin Delany. Now, Robert Athley Rogers, he's traveling around the United States talking about the law of Ethiopia's redemption. Marcus Garvey's talking about Africa for the Africans. Within 2 years, in 1919, Rastafari becomes regent and plenipotentiary, and he sends 4 ambassadors to the United States. Okay. The Royal Ethiopian mission included Dejijmach Nadal, Empress Zaditu's nephew and commander of the Imperial Army, Atul Belengeta Hiroi Wolde Selassie, mayor of Addis Ababa, Atul Kintaba Gabro, mayor of Gondar, and Atul Sinkas, secretary of the commander of the Imperial Army. Their purpose was to renew a treaty of friendship with the United States that was signed by Emperor Menelik in 1904. In honor of their visit, okay, the Ethiopian flag was ceremoniously hoisted over the White House. Here in 1919, and you can see this kind of blurry picture, but the Chicago Defender newspaper, it says, Abyssinian mission arrives in the U.S., and there's a picture of the Ethiopians in their royal robes. And the United States government has to treat these Black men as royal dignitaries, not as second-class Jim Crow citizens. So this creates a huge spectacle. And Black people, especially in Chicago, because of the Chicago Defender newspaper's coverage, are following this event very closely, okay? During the Ethiopian mission, the bloodiest riot in Chicago's history erupted on July 27, 1919. Eugene Williams, a young Black boy, drowned at the 29th Street beach after a rock thrown by George Stauber, a young white boy, knocked Williams from a raft. The Ethiopian Prince Nadal, who stated he had seen the Chicago Defender newspaper in Ethiopia. Why? Because this Black man from Chicago that went to Ethiopia in 1908 was showing the emperor in these newspapers. Prince Nadal told one of the reporters that Ethiopians dislike brutality, burning at the stake, lynching of any nature, and other outrages handed upon the African American. Fight on, don't stop. Now, before the Ethiopian mission ended, an invitation to return to Ethiopia was made to Rabbi Arnold Ford. This is a Black man from Barbados who was living in New That the offer of repatriation was given to him was extremely significant because Rabbi Ford was the leader of the Hebrew Israelite or Black Jews of Harlem. In this capacity, he would be able to resettle the existing remnant of Israel that was captured in the slave trade. In addition, Rabbi Ford was the musical director of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Given that the UNIA was the largest, greatest organization of the scattered Ethiopians or Africans, with over 4 million members, it makes perfect sense to make the offer to the UNIA. And finally, as musical director, Rabbi Ford could use the traditional spiritual medium of song, psalms, hymns, to communicate the Ethiopian message to the massive Black people scattered in North, South, and Central America, and including the Caribbean. And this is exactly what Rabbi Ford did. It is therefore no coincidence that Rabbi Ford gave the Universal Negro Improvement Association the Universal Ethiopian Anthem, which was later to be used by the Ethiopian World Federation, which still sings it at its gatherings today. Now, during this same year as the Ethiopian mission, a Black man from Chicago named Reverend James Morris Webb published a treatise entitled "A Black Man Will Be the Coming Universal King, Proven by Biblical History." Reverend Webb's prophecies were based on the 4th chapter of Micah, the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk, and the 3rd chapter of Joel. Reverend James Morris Webb then began preaching from his pamphlet to the UNIA on October 22nd and again on November 5th. Another Black man at the same time named Grover Redding, who also lived in Chicago and witnessed the visit of the Ethiopian mission, began to preach that the visit of the 4 Ethiopian ambassadors was the actual literal fulfillment of Psalm 68:31. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. Okay, so again, Black people in America, right, were not Christians until largely after Nat Turner's rebellion. They were taught a form of Christianity orally because of this plan by Reverend Charles Colcock Jones, right? And they weren't really able to study the Bible themselves, except for a handful of free Negroes, okay? But by 1919, Black people were reading the Bible and interpreting events that were happening in that day according to this book that they believed was the word of God. And they believed that, again, princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands. Okay. Redding also preached that the Ethiopian mission fulfilled Isaiah 18, verses 1 through 7. And I won't go into that into details, but there's a prophecy, right? And he interpreted that prophecy because it was talked about these ambassadors coming from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. He also saw a prophecy in Zephaniah that explained to him the meaning of all of this, right? Now, I only have 1 hour for this presentation, so I'm going to skip all that, but you can go back and you can look at all this. Put it in there and get a copy of the presentation. Take your time with it. But in addition to studying the biblical prophecies in the Bible about these Ethiopians who were supposed to come to the eagle, America, the American eagle, they were also studying this treaty of friendship that the Ethiopian ambassadors reviewed with the United States. And basically what it said was, right, that Ethiopian citizens were to be accorded rights and privileges that he, as a Black man, descended from the Africans brought to America against their will and chains, right? Ethiopians were to be treated as first-class citizens. And that in the future, Ethiopia was going to have greater contact with America for commercial purposes. So on the one hand, Prophet Redding, seeking to escape his second-class Jim Crow status and condition, saw salvation in what he called Ethiopian citizenship. As an Ethiopian, he and others would be able to freely travel and to transact business throughout the United States with the security that American citizens and foreigners in the United States would have. So therefore, Prophet Redding sought to renounce his American Jim Crow Negro status and become a citizen of Ethiopia, pledging his allegiance to the government of the heir to the throne, right, Ras Tafara. Okay? And he started this organization called the Star Order of Ethiopia. And they started organizing, and to become a member, they had to make this application, and then sign it, which said, "This is to certify that my name was given to Elder Grover Redding, missionary to Abyssinia, also known as Ethiopia, to show my brothers in my motherland that I am with them, heart and soul. I have signed my name as an Ethiopian in America in sympathy with our motherland, Ethiopia. I henceforth denounce the name Negro, which was given me by another race. Membership entailed signing the application that committed oneself to return to my motherland of Ethiopia in order to fulfill one of 44 positions, such as electrical engineer, mechanical craftsman, architect, chemist, painter, cartoonist, illustrator, auto repair, agriculture, poultry raising." Okay. So there's this growing movement in Chicago. And again, remember, there's a black man in Chicago already in Ethiopia. And so now there's direct communication, direct between Ethiopia and Chicago, all about how this person, Rastafari, is going to become king and how he's going to be coming back to Ethiopia, right, to do business, and how he wants Black Americans to come and help build the country. Okay. So Prophet Redding, expecting this prince, Rastafari, to come out of Ethiopia with arms outstretched in the very near future, which was reported in the Chicago Defender on December 20th, that should be 1919. He at once staged a parade to renounce America. He has this parade to renounce his American Jim Crow citizenship. He burns an American flag, right, on East 35th Street. And there's a shootout, and with the police, the Chicago Defender reports on this with the headline, "Fanatics burn U.S. flag, murder to shoot police, imposter of the Abyssinian government staged gun battle in the street." Okay. Here is a Chicago Daily Tribune, the fatal ending of the Abyssinian parade, right? So there was this effort all the way in 1919 to seek liberation through this biblical framework about these prophecies about Ethiopia, right? And it spread. Here you have Richmond, Virginia. I am Ethiopia. All over, north and south, people started taking on this Ethiopian identity. Why? Because they don't have much education, and the education they have comes from the Bible. And by this time, they're interpreting the Bible as, through this Ethiopian framework. Again, on December 20th, it should be 1919, the Chicago Defender wrote, "Planning for the Abyssinians. The king of Abyssinia will be crowned, and then he will appoint his representatives who will accompany the prince here to resume commercial trade with the United States." So Black Chicagoans were reading this, and they were getting ready for the Ethiopian prince to come and get them. Now, on March 29th, 1922, Marcus Garvey addressed the Newark, New Jersey division of the UNIA at a mass gathering attended by Robert Athley Rogers, who had been traveling throughout Central and South America preaching the law of Ethiopian redemption. Okay. At this 1922 UNI convention, Reverend Webb is there. He lectures the UNIA on the coming of a universal Black king. And at the convention, Persian Consul General H. Tolpakian read a message from the Ethiopian Regent Plenipotentiary Rastafari. And the message said, "I invite African Americans back to the homeland, particularly those qualified to help solve our big problems and to develop our vast resources. Teachers, artisans, mechanics, writers, musicians, professional men and women, all who are able to lend a hand in the constructive work which our country so deeply feels and greatly needs." Marcus Garvey was then elected president of the Republic of Africa. And at this time, Earl Little, Malcolm X's father, is the president of the Omaha chapter of the UNIA. Okay. In 1922, Marcus Garvey also makes this startling prophecy in his article, Solution for World Peace. He says, "We hear a great deal of talk about world peace today. Wilson of America, Lloyd George of England, Clemenceau of France a few years ago prophesied at Versailles a reign of peace. Up to the present, many of the leading statesmen of the world have pledged themselves to a program of world peace. Many conferences have been held, political as well as industrial, for the purpose of settling the question of peace. But up to now, none of them has laid the foundation for a real peace, for a lasting peace. The peace of the world cannot be settled by political conferences or by industrial conferences only. If we are to have world peace, it will only come when a great interracial conference is called, when Jew will meet Gentile, when Anglo-Saxon will meet the Teuton, when the great Caucasian family will meet the Mongolian, and when all will meet the Negro, and then and there straighten out the differences that have kept us apart for hundreds of years and will continue to keep us apart until doomsday, if something is not done to create better racial understanding. Now, I'm telling you this prophecy now from 1922. It's going to become important because later on in the, we're actually, this great conference that he's talking about actually happens. It's called the World Conference Against Racism. It happened in 2001. And then right after that, I'll get to that in a little bit. Hang on, let me jump ahead. So 2 years after this Marcus Garvey convention, right, in 24, Robert Athley Rogers writes this book called The Holy Pivot, the Black Man's Bible. It becomes a sacred book of the Ethiopian movement and the early Rastafari movement. Also in 1924, on behalf of the 4th Annual Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World, Garvey writes to the Ethiopian Empress Zawditu, "Greetings from the 400 million Negroes of the world through our convention now sitting in New York. We hope for you and your country a reign of progress and happiness. Our desire is to help you maintain the glory of Ethiopia. Your expression of goodwill towards us 2 years ago through your Consul General is highly cherished, and we are looking forward to the day when large numbers of us will become citizens of Ethiopia." So again, prior to the Civil War, you have all of this expectation. People are ready to go back to Africa, and it gets sabotaged by Frederick Douglass, the integrationists and the abolitionists. Okay, even after that, by 1924, you have this momentum again. Everybody's now starting to take on this Ethiopian identity. They're getting ready to go back to Ethiopia. An entire movement is started, which will eventually become the Rastafari movement because of all of this activity. Again, Charles Henry Holmes writes this book, Ethiopia, the Land of a Promise. Grover Redding and his movement in Chicago. Reverend Reb is telling everyone, read the Bible, coming of a black, universal black king. And you have Garvey, right? So all of this is happening. This is a buildup. This is part of the story that's rarely ever told. Okay, there happens to be a Jamaican dude in Chicago, and he kind of learns all about this in New York. He's in New York. He learns all about all of that's happening. And then he goes back to Jamaica, and he starts talking about Rastafari because he had learned it in the United States. And a lot of people credit this man, Leonard Howell, with starting the Rastafari movement. They think it started in Jamaica, but he actually brought it to Jamaica from the United States. And so at that time, the tenets of the people who are called the Rastafarites in the United States, here were its tenets, its principles: an acceptance of an Ethiopian identity, rejection of white supremacy, use of biblical prophecy, recognition of a messianic universal black king, a pledge of allegiance to the government of Rastafari, which is the government of Ethiopia, use of the picture of the prince about to become king, about to become emperor, physical return to Ethiopia for the purpose of building an Ethiopian empire, use of Ethiopian flags and parades, martyrdom in defense of Ethiopian freedom, and organization for repatriation to Ethiopia. This is the movement, right, by 1925. Now, on October 7th, 1928, Rastafari, he's crowned Negus, king of Ethiopia. And he sends 100 Ethiopian students abroad. And then in November 1930, right, Negus Tafari is crowned Haile Selassie, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah, Emperor of Ethiopia. Okay, Robert Daniel Robert Alexander, he's there to witness. There's 100 Africans from the Americas that are at the coronation. You can see here is a picture of the Chicago Defender, how they covered it. It says crowned King of Kings. The Crisis magazine, this was Du Bois magazine, showed this picture, and they wrote about it. The Chicago Defender of November 8th pictured Rastafari with the caption, crowned King of Kings. And a front page story announced, amid splendor and pomp that would have put the Roman Empire in its palmy days into the shade, His Majesty Rastafari, the ruler of Ethiopia, was crowned Haile Selassie, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, and elect of God, on Sunday morning. His ancestry traces back to King Solomon. So Black people in America who are reading their Bibles and they're hearing these Black men saying, look to Ethiopia for this universal Black king, it actually happens. The newspaper are reporting this. He has this title, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. So people are now like, okay, wow, we're about to get our liberation that was prophesied in the Bible, right? This is not some fringe lunatic thing going on. This is, the whole world is watching this, right? Within 2 years of Rastafari becoming Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, the peace movement of Ethiopia is established in Chicago by Miss Gordon. The Chicago Defender newspaper describes their purpose as repatriating all unemployed, hopeless Negroes off of the relief rolls to be returned to Africa, where they can develop themselves in a country under Black leadership, where their opportunities will not be limited, and where the thousands of others who desire to be free from slavery. Petitions containing the names of 400,000 members of the race were sent to President Roosevelt from the various branches established strategically all over the country. The peace movement of Ethiopia was successful in getting the Virginia legislatures to pass a resolution endorsing the repatriation of people of African descent. Now, on June 15th, 1935, the Chicago Defender stated in big bold letters atop the front of its cover, war in Ethiopia by September. Above several pictures of Emperor Haile Selassie and his troops, read, standing under a huge umbrella, resplendent in color and tinged with gold, Emperor Haile Selassie, King of Kings and Lion of the tribe of Judah, startled the world this week with his pronouncement on the Italian-Ethiopian controversy. Speaking directly to Black Muslim men who had gathered by the thousands from all parts of the country to pledge their loyalty to the government, the emperor took advantage of the occasion to warn Black people everywhere, including those in the United States, that they owed their loyalty and support to Ethiopia. I am not only emperor of Africa, I am king of all Negroes everywhere, including those in the United States and other foreign domains. The Italian warlord is trying to destroy the last best hope you have on earth. Now remember, when he says, I'm the king of all Negroes everywhere, that's true because there are no free people anywhere left on the planet. Okay? The Earth's original people, the African people on the African continent have been colonized. Everywhere else, African people are under colonial rule, even in the United States. Okay? On July 20th, the Chicago Defender, right, runs on the front page, Ethiopian conflict stirs the world. Is Ethiopia stretching forth her hands? Believe world headed for biblical Armageddon. World uprising and Italian-Ethiopian war foreseen by writer. Forthcoming conflict may be the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. Would-be race war and end of white domination is possible outcome. This is what is being reported in the newspaper in Chicago, because again, the Italians, they're getting ready to invade Ethiopia because that's the last remaining territory, and the Italians want it so that they can build their colonial empire. In Chicago, 5,000 Black men volunteered to defend Ethiopia, but were prevented by the United States government. So they're allowed to go and fight in other world wars, Korea, World War II and all of that, Vietnam. They weren't allowed to go and defend Ethiopia. In September 1935, Emperor Haile Selassie signs the General Mobilization Order for his troops to defend against the Italian invasion. Okay? Colonel John C. Robinson from Chicago becomes the emperor's pilot. So a black man from Chicago becomes the emperor's pilot and trains the Ethiopian Air Force, which would eventually become Ethiopian Airlines. Black people all over the world volunteer to go to Ethiopia and fight to defend the last sovereign nation in Africa. Martin Luther King Sr. oversees the Ethiopian defense fundraising in the state of Georgia. Okay, so we don't learn about this in our schools and in the history books. Okay, they don't tell us this, especially when talking about World War II. So here the Ethiopians are getting ready to mobilize, right? One of the latest, here you go, one of the latest pictures out of Addis Ababa of Colonel John C. Robinson, head of the Royal Ethiopian Air Force, who after direct orders from Emperor Haile Selassie is to lead a squadron of special bombing planes in an assault on certain mountains, which are to be blasted in the campaign of Ethiopia to halt the advance of the Italians on Addis Ababa. Military experts gasped at the audacity of the plan, many calling it a strategic and feasible a maneuver as was the trick that Hannibal of Carthage played on the ancient Romans by lining the hills with oxen and carrying lighted torches. The Romans, history relates, followed the oxen, thereby leaving themselves open to a Carthaginian attack. Haile Selassie is sworn to die before surrendering to the Ethiopians, decided to blow up the mountains as a last resort to save his kingdom. Okay, so you have a black man from Chicago who's the royal commander of the Ethiopian Air Force, leading the mission in the defense of the free Ethiopians. And you don't ever hear about, we always hear about the Tuskegee Airmen that came after. But the real story about the real Ethiopian, the real black pilot, right, is Colonel Robinson. And they don't teach us that. And there's a reason why. So now we're going to get into, the stage is set to understand Haile Selassie in the Battle of Armageddon. And this is all important to what's going to happen with Malcolm X following. Okay? Now, again, one side is using the Bible to say they are the rulers of the earth, and the other side is using the Bible to say, no, we're Ethiopians and our day is coming. Okay? You get to Revelation 16. And the Revelation 16 said the king, this is the part where it says the kings of the earth are going to gather to make war against God. Revelation 16, verse 13 says, and I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And the 7th angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, it is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not seen since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Now, let's unpack this. Right after World War I, which took place in 1914 and 1918, 65 million men were mobilized, 35 to 50 million dead or wounded. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson declared that the war, World War I, was fought to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson then made an unprecedented state visit to Europe, and like a messiah, he promised the world everlasting justice and peace by establishing a covenant called the Charter of the League of Nations. This is Revelation 16:13, the foul spirit from the mouth of the false prophet. Okay? Why is he the prophet, false prophet? Because he said this covenant, this charter of the League of Nations, is going to make the world safe for democracy. But that didn't happen because then you had the Italians invade Ethiopia, and then you had World War II. So he said we're going to bring world peace, but instead we get World War II. Now, in 1929, Benito Mussolini, the prime minister of the fascist government of Rome, this is Revelation 13b, the dragon, signed the Lateran Treaty, trading secular temporal power for spiritual protection, okay, by giving a square mile of its capital seat, called the Vatican, to the Pope. So before 1929, the Catholic Church and the Pope is fighting the Italian government over loss of their prestige and what the Italian, they had the separation of church and state. The Pope is saying, hey, we're supreme. We're supposed to be ruling the earth. You can't separate church and state. And so they're battling with the Italian government. And finally, Benito Mussolini solves this problem, says, okay, we're going to give you this territory. It's independent, right? It's yours. You are now sovereign, right? And it reestablishes the Pope's and the Catholic Church sovereignty in the earth. Okay, this happens in 1929. It's Benito Mussolini who does this. Okay, then the beast, the Pope, blessed the dragon, right? This Pope right here, Pope Pius XI. Okay, the beast blesses the dragon, Benito Mussolini. The beast blessed the dragon to invade Ethiopia in violation of the Charter of the League of Nations. The dragon, Benito Mussolini, he stands on, this balcony and he shouts, Ethiopia is mine. Okay, so it's the Pope that blesses the Italians and says, go invade Ethiopia. You're doing God's will. This is what God wants. We know because we are the representatives of God, because we're the Pope, we're the Catholic Church. And we already said, as we covered in the first lecture, right, how they had, created this whole idea that they are the religious rulers of the world through, this apostolic authority. Okay. Now, at this time, 8 dictatorships, Germany, Italy, Poland, Hungary, Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Austria, along with 2 democracies, Great Britain and France, sought to betray the principles of collective security enshrined in the Charter, and they sacrificed the blameless Ethiopians to the beast and the dragon. Revelation 17 says, in verse 12, and the 10 horns, again, it's 10 powers, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. So it's not me saying this, it's the Revelation saying that there's going to be 10 nations on earth that are going to be guilty of conspiring against someone with the titles King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's not me saying that, it's the book of Revelation saying that. Here you have the New York Times. Big Italian force invades Ethiopia. Mussolini rallies 20 million fascists. Roosevelt to keep the U.S. unentangled. So they're betraying, these 10 horns, they're betraying the covenant that they signed before God with the League of Nations. On June 30th, 1936, the League of Nations, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, convened to consider the question of Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. Again, this is Revelation 16, 14, and 16. His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, anointed with the messianic titles King of Kings and Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, a blood descendant of the biblical David, reigning from David's throne in a country reputed to have the Ark of the Covenant, showed up on the morning of June 26, 1936, to present his appeal to the League of Nations. On June 25th, His Majesty Haile Selassie recalls in his autobiography, we set out from London and went to Geneva by way of Paris, arriving there by train on the following morning. Subsequently, June 30th, 1936 was the day fixed for us to speak our mind before the representatives of 52 nations assembled. Again, this is Revelation 16:15. It says, behold, I come like a thief. just kind of shows up one morning, and 4 days later, he is now before the League of Nations. At the League of Nations, on the rostrum, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, said, I, Haile Selassie, am here today to claim that justice which is due to my people and the assistance promised to it 8 months ago when 52 nations asserted that aggression had been committed in violation of international treaties. There is no precedent for a head of state himself speaking in this assembly. He informs them of the terrible poison of harmful gases, right? He says, there's never before been an example of any government proceeding to the systematic extermination of a nation by barbarous means in violation of the most solemn promises made by the nations of the earth that this should not happen. It is my duty to inform the governments assembled in Geneva, right, responsible as they are for the lives of millions of men, women, and children, of the deadly peril which threatens them, by describing to them the fate which has been suffered by Ethiopia. He talks about how the Italians sprayed poison gas. They took 18 planes and they put sprayers on the ends of these wings, and they flew these planes all over the territory of Ethiopia, poisoning the land, the water, the cattle, everything. Okay? So this is a new kind of warfare that the earth has never seen. This is why Haile Selassie goes to the League of Nations saying, look, they're exterminating all life in Ethiopia. This is unprecedented evil. He says, I assert that the problem submitted to the assembly today is a much wider one. In a word, it is international morality that is stake. And he concludes by saying, what reply shall I take back to my people? This is this long speech, League of Nations, right? Again, he describes the attacks and how they dropped these canisters and they sprayed poison rain all over the land and water, right, in order to kill off systematically all living creatures, right? He explains all of this. As the emperor left the rostrum at the League of Nations, he was heard to say, today it is us, tomorrow it will be you. You have struck the match in Ethiopia, but it shall burn in Europe. With those fateful words, judgment was cast, as it was written in Isaiah 11:4. He shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth and with the breath of his lips, and he shall slay the wicked. In Revelations 19:15-16, from his mouth issues a sharp sword with which to smite the nations, and on his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The nations have sunk, Psalms 9:15-16. The nations have sunk in the pit which they made, in the net they hid has their own foot been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. In Obadiah 15, as you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deed shall return on your own head. So basically, he said, you have struck the match in Ethiopia, but it shall burn in Europe. Meaning, the violations of this covenant that you are allowing to happen in Ethiopia, they're going to come back to haunt you. The voice of Ethiopia says Ethiopia is not conquered. Ask the question, will Europe answer the emperor's plea before it perishes? The emperor of Ethiopia and his prophecy. Again, this is how the world press is reporting all of this. They are saying that these world events and biblical prophecy are like coinciding. And so what happened? For claiming the authority of God, enslaving the earth's original people, stealing them, their land and resources, and attempting to commit genocide and exterminate them while finally breaking the solemn covenant of peace made before God at the League of Nations, Europe earned the wrath of God. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords spoke, and the extermination of the descendants of the Shashu who first invaded Africa began, right? Extermination of the Jews, and then was followed by World War II. So the emperor's words came true. He said, you struck the match in Ethiopia, but it shall burn in Europe. And so this world peace that Woodrow Wilson prophesied, what happened? You had World War II death. You had World War II. More deaths in human history than in any other event in human history. 58% of Allied civilians deaths, right? So you can see here, these are all the deaths, right? And these are the countries that suffered all of this death and destruction. Now, on May 5th, 1941, exactly 5 years to the day that Italy invaded, Haile Selassie returned to his throne, having defeated the Italians. There's a video of this. I don't have time to show it because we got to get to Malcolm X, right? But you got to know all of this to really understand what's happening. Okay? Concerning the support given to Ethiopia during the war, Haile Selassie said, as it turns out, a genuine friend is tested in times of crisis. And the heavy challenge we encounter has enabled us to distinguish between a friend and a foe. We cannot afford passing without mentioning the substantial support and political agitation which millions of Americans, particularly Black Americans, have made. Thus, as a reward for their support in 1948, Haile Selassie granted 5 gashas, or 500 acres of land in Shashamane, to be administered through the Ethiopian World Federation. So he's saying to the Black people, look, before all of this, I was trying to get you to come back home to Ethiopia. Now I got to rebuild the country. I want you to come back home, and I'm giving you land, okay? Remember, when the Italians invaded, again, it's only one group. If the Ethiopians had lost this and Haile Selassie didn't return victorious, there are no independent nations in Africa today. None. Okay, and also remember, when Charles Henry Holmes wrote this book, Ethiopia, the Land of Promise, in 1917, this is before the Italian invasions, right? In the book, he says they kept meeting on May 5th. And that they would form this Ethiopian Union. Now, again, it's May 5th, the day that Haile Selassie regains his throne. How can it be that a book is written that this would happen before it happens? Okay, I'm just putting that out there. So after this Battle of Armageddon, the work of rebuilding Ethiopia begins. Emperor Haile Selassie resumed his program to bring African Americans back to, because that was his plan before all of this. He wants to bring all African Americans back. Colonel Robinson stays in Ethiopia. He trains the first 81 pilots to form Ethiopian Airlines. So now you got airplanes, okay? The emperor is ready to come to the United States himself to gather his people. And for 18 months before, and for 6 weeks during the emperor's visit to the United States in 1954, Haile Selassie began a repatriation recruitment program for Black people in New York, Pennsylvania, Washington, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Illinois. Here are some of the newspaper clippings of when the emperor came and visited all these places. Lion of Judah conquers the Windy City. Selassie wants 100 million. Ethiopian Emperor Chicago's king for a day. Selassie's special message for Negroes. On June 8, 1954, His Imperial Majesty told 1,100 of Chicago's top business, civic, and government leaders that unlimited opportunities exist in Ethiopia for American capital and pioneering spirit. Having recognized the no small part that Africans in America contributed, Haile Selassie made the following offer. It was reported in the newspaper. He said he was ready and offering African Americans a house rent-free, a salary at least equaling that which applicants are now earning or could earn in America, free transportation to Ethiopia for applicants and their families, annual 3 months vacations with pay, and in some instances, automobiles provided by the government. Persons interested in applying for employment in Ethiopia or receiving additional information are advised to write the Ethiopian Embassy in Washington. Sundiata Acoli, an African liberation soldier imprisoned in America, writes, Africans from Africa, having fought to save European independence, returned to the African continent and began fighting for the independence of their own colonized nations. Rather than fight losing African colonial wars, most European nations opted to grant phased independence to the African colonies. The U.S. now faced the prospect of thousands of African diplomatic personnel, their staff, and families coming to the UN and wandering into a minefield of incidents, particularly on state visits to the rigidly segregated Washington, D.C. Capitol. That alone could push each newly emerging independent African nation into the socialist column. To counteract this possibility, the U.S. decided to desegregate. As a result, on May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court declared school segregation illegal. Just prior to Haile Selassie's arrival in the United States, an editorial in the Ethiopian Herald newspaper stated that so intermeshed are the interests of our present-day world that whatever happens in one part may have repercussions in wide areas elsewhere. The United States Supreme Court's decision last Monday on segregated state schools in that country takes its place in this category. Sensitive to embarrassment before the world that the specter of racial segregation, particularly in education, it might have during the visit of a Black emperor of Ethiopia, the U.S. passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision when it did, just 1 week before His Majesty's arrival, in order to show off the progress the U.S. was making in race relations. According to the United States government amicus curiae brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, it is in the context of the present world struggle between freedom and tyranny that the problem of racial discrimination must be viewed. For discrimination against minority groups in the U.S. has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises integrity even among friendly nations as to the it raises doubts even among friendly nations as to the integrity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Okay, so what's going on here is the Emperor of Ethiopia is coming to America with his repatriation offer to get Black people to leave America. The United States government orchestrates this entire media campaign to change the narrative from the emperor is coming to get Black people to go to Ethiopia to America just passed the Brown versus Board of Education Brown versus Board of Education decision. It's going to end racial discrimination. There's now hope for Black people in America, and we want to show off integration. We want Black people to believe that there's hope for them in America. So the United States State Department makes this counter move against the Ethiopians to once again block Black people from leaving America and returning to their motherland and fatherland, just like they did at the Civil War. Every time we're ready to leave, the United States comes with this integration thing. And they orchestrate the entire emperor's visit to get Haile Selassie to talk about the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And they totally suppress information about what he's offering Black people to go back to America, except in the Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender newspaper. Okay. Meanwhile, the emperor, he's talking about how African people are all linked together. Okay. Now, at the same time, this is where we start to get into the story of Malcolm X. Okay. At the time that Haile Selassie comes to the United States to get African Americans, the liberation struggle in Kenya has started with a group of freedom fighters called the Mau. Okay. Malcolm in 1955 travels to the Bandung, Indonesia, for the Conference of Non-Aligned Nations. And while he's there with other liberation leaders from around the world. And this is where he first really starts learning what it's going to take for Black people in America to get free, okay? And then that same year, 1955, you have Rosa Parks refuse to move to the back of the bus, which is going to kick off a whole new level of resistance, okay? In the spring and summer of 1955, Malcolm makes his first trips abroad, visiting Ghana, Sudan, Nigeria, Iran, Syria, Egypt, and the United Arab Republic. And again, he had just been to the Bandung Conference with liberation leaders. Okay, so Malcolm X is now going to Ghana. 2 years later, Ghana is the first to achieve their independence. When that happens, Martin Luther King says, don't think that because Ghana only has 5 million people, the nation can't grow, that that's a small nation to be overlooked. Never forget the fact that when America was born in 1776, when it received its independence from the British Empire, there were less than 4 million people in America. And today it's more than 160 million. So never underestimate a people because it's small now. America was smaller than Ghana when it was born. Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor never voluntarily gives freedom to the oppressed. You have to work for it. And if Nkrumah and the people of the Gold Coast had not stood up persistently, revolting against the system, it would still be a colony of the British Empire. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there, and he never voluntarily gives it up. And that is where the strong resistance comes. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. If we wait for it to work itself out, it will never be worked out. Freedom only comes through persistent revolt, through persistent agitation, through persistently rising up against the system of evil. The bus protest is just the beginning. Dr. King had already begun to promote going back to Africa. In his sermon, The Birth of a New Nation, delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on April 7, 1957, Dr. King stated, "Yes, there is a wilderness ahead, though it is my hope that even people from America will go to Africa as immigrants, right there to the Gold Coast, and lend their technical assistance. For there is great need and there are rich opportunities there. Right now is the time that American Negroes can lend their technical assistance to a growing new nation. I was very happy to see already people who have moved in and making good. The son of the late president of Bennett College, Dr. Jones, is there, who started an insurance company, is making good and going to the top. A doctor from Brooklyn, New York had just come in that week, and his wife is also a dentist, and they are living there now and going in there and working, and the people love them. There will be hundreds and thousands of people, I'm sure, going over to make for the growth of this new nation. And Nkrumah made it very clear to me that he would welcome any person coming there. There is a great day ahead. The future is on its side. It's going now through the wilderness, but the promised land is ahead." So here you have Malcolm X going back to Africa. Here you have Martin Luther King going back to Africa. Now Ethiopia is free. Ghana is free. Both of them are saying, come back, African Americans, come back, we're ready for you. This is what's going on by 1957. In 1959, Malcolm X goes back to Kenya and develops a friendship with Pio Gama Pinto, a member of the ruling Kenyan African National League. Pinto was responsible for organizing and arming the Mau Mau liberation fighters. And together, they planned a common strategy to deal with the daily humiliations and indignities suffered by both Africans and African Americans. So this is where I'm going to end part 2. Okay. In summary, the Battle of Armageddon has taken place. The Pope and the Catholic Church blessed the Italians to invade Ethiopia to destroy the last independent free people in Africa. Miraculously, the Ethiopians win with the help of a black man from Chicago, Colonel John Robinson, who becomes the Ethiopian Royal Air Force commander. The Ethiopians regain their throne. The emperor regains the throne. He goes to the League of Nations, condemns the world for betraying Ethiopia and their promises to support small nations who are attacked by aggressor nations. He puts international morality at stake. And with the title King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he judges them. He tells them what has happened to the Ethiopians is now going to happen to you. He goes back to Ethiopia, regains his throne, and World War II breaks out in Europe. 60 million people, I don't know how many millions people, die as a result. And after that, the freedom and liberation and independence movement in Africa has now started. This is where we learn what happened, the half that has never been told.